In 2003, auditors found a bank account in the Cayman Islands with 3.95 billion euros. The problem? The account didn't exist. The bank that supposedly managed it had never heard of it. And the company that owned this phantom account, it had just been voted the sixth most respected company in Europe. Over the next 20 minutes, you're going to discover how an Italian dairy company built one of the largest accounting fraud schemes in European history, and why almost nobody outside of Italy knows this story. When you think about corporate fraud, you probably think of Enron, Theranos, maybe Bernie Madoff. But Parmalat? This story was deliberately buried. Not by accident, by design. And the reason is simple. It exposed something that European markets didn't want to admit, that their protections were worthless, that their auditors were complicit, and that billions of euros could simply evaporate. This is Collapse Chronicles. I dig up the corporate scandals the media forgot. And this is too absurd to be real. But it was. Parma, Italy, 1961. A 22-year-old guy named Callisto Tanzi inherits a small canning factory from his family. Nothing special, they make canned tomatoes, some dairy products for the local market. It's a neighborhood business. But Tanzi had a vision. He saw that Italy was modernizing, that housewives didn't want to boil fresh milk every morning anymore. He saw convenience before it was trending. In 1963, he launches UHT milk, ultra-pasteurized milk that lasts months without refrigeration. And he gives the product a name, Parmalat. Parma, from the city, meaning milk in Italian. And it works. By the 70s, Parmalat dominates the Italian market. By the 80s, they're in Africa, Latin America, Australia. By the 90s, they're the most global dairy brand on the planet. 135 factories, 36,000 employees, presence in 50 countries. But here's the problem. Expanding globally costs money. A lot of money. And Parmalat was growing too fast. They were buying small companies in Asia and Africa in places where audits were, let's say, flexible. And somewhere in the middle of this aggressive expansion, Callisto Tanzi made a choice that would transform his company into a financial time bomb. But before we get there, you need to understand how a fraud of this magnitude goes unnoticed for 15 years. And the answer begins with an Italian obsession: football. Parmalat buys Parma Football Club. In Italy, this isn't just a marketing move. It's status. It's political power. It's sitting with prime ministers and bankers. And Tanzi loved it. He transforms Parma into a giant, signs stars, wins the UEFA Cup twice. But football teams don't make profit. They bleed money. And Parmalat was covering the bills. Now here's where things get interesting. Because at the same time Tanzi is funding an elite team, Parmalat's financial reports show consistent profits, healthy growth, robust cash flow. Wall Street analysts love the company. So how? Simple. The subsidiaries. Parmalat had hundreds of them. Smaller companies it controlled in countries like Curacao, Cayman Islands, Malta. Places with loose regulations and lots of privacy. And Tanzi created an ingenious system. These subsidiaries will buy products from Parmalat headquarters. On paper. Only on paper. The transactions were recorded. The revenue appeared in Italian Parmalat's books. But the money? The money never actually arrived. Imagine you have a lemonade stand, and you create a phantom company in your garage that buys 1,000 cups a day from you. You put that sale in your cash book. But the money, you never actually transfer it. You just write, the garage company owes me $5,000. And the next year, you create another phantom company in the basement, which buys from the garage company. And so the debt keeps moving, always one step ahead of the audit. That was it. Parmalat was creating revenue out of thin air through a network of subsidiaries selling to subsidiaries selling to subsidiaries. A Russian matryoshka doll fraud. But there's a limit, right? Eventually, auditors are going to ask, where's the real money? And that's when Callisto Tanzi did the most absurd thing in this story. He invented a bank. Bank of America, Cayman Islands. In 1999, Parmalat reports to its auditors that it has an account at this Caribbean branch with $4.9 billion in liquid assets. 4.9 billions. To put this in perspective, that represented more than half the market value of the entire company. It was the financial cushion that justified all the loans, all the expansions, all the investor confidence. And it was completely fake. The account didn't exist. Never existed. And the evidence Parmalat presented to auditors? A letter from Bank of America confirming the balance. Except the letter was forged. Crudely forged. The paper was wrong, the signature was wrong, the format was wrong. A junior financial analyst could have spotted it in 10 seconds. And nobody checked. For 4 years. Let me tell you how this was finally discovered. Because it wasn't through investigative brilliance. It wasn't through courageous whistleblowers. It was through incompetence. Late 2003. Parmalat needs to raise 300 million euros through debt securities. Institutional investors want to do due diligence, it's standard. And one of them asks for direct confirmation from Bank of America about that Cayman account. Bank of America receives the request and responds, "What account?" And here the house of cards begins to collapse. Because Parmalat can't produce evidence. They buy time, present more documents, all fake. And on December 19, 2003, Bank of America issues a public statement. There is not and never has been a Bonlat account Parmalat subsidiary at Bank of America Cayman Islands. The next day, Parmalat shares drop 40%. A week later, the company enters bankruptcy administration. And when forensic investigators enter the offices in Parma, they discover something even more shocking. 14,000 fake bank accounts, thousands of phantom subsidiaries, and an accounting hole of 14 billion euros. 14 billion that simply never existed. But the question that breaks your brain, how? How do you hide 14 billion euros that don't exist for 15 years? The answer is in 3 letters, CFO. Fausto Tana, Parmalat's chief financial officer for decades. And he was a genius. Not an ethical genius, but a genius in creative accounting. Tana used something called double billing. Parmalat would sell milk to a supermarket, say, in Venezuela. They'd record the sale. Normal. But then through subsidiaries, they'd record the same sale again and again, multiplying revenue. They created shell companies that would buy products, generate receipts, create accounts receivable. And these receivables were then sold to banks as legitimate assets. The banks packaged these rotten assets into financial products and sold them to investors. It's Enron on steroids, with Parmesan cheese. But the real question is, who else knew? Grant Thornton and Deloitte, Parmalat's auditors, were found to be complicit. They were signing off on accounts that couldn't be mathematically true. Bank of America, although it didn't manage the fake account, managed other suspicious transactions and never reported them. Credit Suisse, Citigroup, UBS all structured financial operations knowing the numbers didn't add up. And the most disturbing part? In 2004, investigators found a handwritten notebook in Tanzi's office. Pages and pages of calculations, crossed out numbers, debt circulating between subsidiaries like an insane chess game. It was physical proof that this wasn't an error. It was architecture. It was a second set of books where the truth was written in pen. In January 2004, Callisto Tanzi is arrested. He confesses everything. Says it started small, covering holes from the football team, diversions of 200 to 300 million. But the more he lied, the more he needed to lie to cover the previous lies. It was a snowball of financial fiction. And when it stopped, 118,000 Italian investors lost their savings. Retirees who owned Parmalat shares saw their wealth evaporate. 36,000 people lost their jobs. 14 billion euros. Buried in accounts that never existed. In an empire built on paper and audacity. So what happened after? Tanzi was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Fausto Tana got 2.5 years. Grant Thornton paid millions in fines but never admitted guilt. The banks? Out-of-court settlements. Nobody really paid proportionally to the crime. Parmalat was restructured, relaunched in 2005, and today, it exists. It was bought by French Lactalis in 2011 and still sells milk across Europe. It's as if the fraud was just an inconvenient hiccup. But here's why this story matters in 2025. First, Parmalat proved that epic-scale fraud doesn't need futuristic technology. It just needs offshore subsidiaries, compliant auditors, and regulators asleep at the wheel. Second, it exposed that the global audit system is fundamentally broken. The same firms that audit also offer consulting. The conflict of interest is structural. Third, and perhaps most disturbing, nobody learned. 7 years after Parmalat, we had the 2008 crisis. 15 years later, we had Wirecard in Germany, 1.9 billion euros in cash that didn't exist. Again, Parmalat isn't a historical anomaly. It's a template. And it's being used right now in some corporate office by someone who learned that you don't need to create real value. You just need to create the illusion of value long enough to cash out. So next time you see a company growing too fast, with subsidiaries in tax havens, and a CEO who loves the spotlight, ask the question nobody asked about Parmalat in 1999. Where's the real money? Because if nobody can answer, it's probably not there. Parmalat was buried because it was embarrassing. Because it exposed European markets as vulnerable. Because nobody wanted to admit that 14 billion euros could evaporate while everyone applauded. But here on Collapse Chronicles, I dig up these stories. Because forgotten fraud is fraud that repeats. If you want more corporate scandals the media buried, subscribe to the channel. Every week I drop a case you've never heard of. And leave in the comments, which company do you think is pulling a Parmalat right now? Because I guarantee someone is. I'm Collapse Chronicles. Until the next collapse.